So once upon a time there was a game called Dandy. It was an overhead game where players got to navigate a maze full of monsters to uncover keys, food, bombs, and other things to survive while searching for the exit to move on to the next maze, and so on and so forth. If the concept sounds familiar, it's because Dandy served as the inspiration for the popular 1985 arcade game Gauntlet. Dandy also served as the basis for another game that would see release in 1986 called Dark Chambers, which would grace not only Atari 8-bit computers but also the 2600 video computer system and also the Atari 7800 Pro system. Both 2600 and 7800 versions are available for play on the Atari 50 compilation on modern platforms, and since we sampled the admirable yet still lesser 2600 version of Dark Chambers yesterday, it only makes sense that we follow up with the naturally superior Atari 7800 version of Dark Chambers today. Though really, given that this was released roughly a year after Gauntlet graced the Nintendo Entertainment System, you had to wonder what the mindset of 7800 owners were when they saw Gauntlet in action on the NES with its colorful graphics and fast-paced action, and then along comes Dark Chamber with a similar style of play on their console of choice, but nowhere near as flavorful. It just highlights the overall weakness of the 7800 library at the time and its inability to compete with the growing and evolving NES library, as well as that of the competing Sega Master System and other consoles that would come along later down the road. Going back to a previous example, if you wanted hockey on Nintendo, you had Ice Hockey and later Blades of Steel. But if you wanted hockey on Atari 7800, you were stuck with Hat Trick and, well, yeah. Now fortunately, Dark Chambers is not as bad of a game as Hat Trick was, and thank fuck for that because that would be a pretty dire picture, let me tell you. On the contrary, and despite the already somewhat grim picture I just presented a minute ago, Dark Chambers on its own merits isn't too shabby, and if you've played Gauntlet, or the original source game, Dandy for that matter, the premise should be old hat. You control a little hero dude through dozens of maze-like dungeons, seeking out keys to open doors, slaying monsters and destroying the generators that spawn them, collecting food to restore health and bombs to clear the screen of enemies, treasure for bonus points, and relics to increase your fighting capabilities, all in an effort to seek out the exit that will lead you to the next level. So anyone familiar with Gauntlet should have a basic understanding of how things work, since the gameplay is fairly similar. There are generators that will spawn enemies and you shoot them to kill them. Now Dark Chamber's idea of stronger monsters differs from Gauntlet, which made existing grunts take multiple hits to die, or just introduced new, stronger grunts for you to fight. But in Dark Chamber, you have a food chain of sorts of enemy grunts, Zombie representing the lowliest of foes on this chain, and the Reaper representing the strongest. You kill an enemy high on said chain, and they'll turn into a weaker enemy for you to take down, and this process continues until you eventually kill the weakest enemy of the chain, the Zombie. It's a practice that was also implemented in the 2600 version, and it's a rather annoying mechanic that feels like a somewhat lazy attempt at instilling some level of challenge to the game, on top of just spawning as much enemy fodder on screen for you to cut down and eventually be overwhelmed by as possible. Other than that though, Dark Chambers isn't all that deep. The gameplay here is fairly simplistic and somewhat on the slow side of things, but it does get challenging after a dozen maps in. Controls are pretty simple to figure out. The stick or D-pad, depending on what you're using as a controller, moves your hero around, one button shoots and the other uses a bomb if you have any on hand, and it's fairly responsive overall. Just in terms of how the game plays, the only real complaints you could probably levy towards the game is the slow speed and the somewhat sparse levels early on, but other than that, Dark Chambers presents a fairly competent game that boasts over 20-ish levels of play, about 3 or 4 skill settings, I don't recall how much, and can be played either solo or with a second player in co-op fashion, which is always a nice added value for these sorts of games. Dark Chambers, visually, lives up to its name. Its mazes are rather dark and gloomy with its dark floors and simplistic walls of varying shapes and sizes, which are the only distinguishing features among the different levels. The character sprites and item pickups are rather tiny looking, but at the very least, you can tell the difference between a ghost and a skeleton, among other things, so you've got that much going for it at least. Game, as mentioned, runs a bit on the slow side, but the scrolling is rather smooth, and that title screen is a nice first impression for newcomers of its depths. On the sound front, minimal is probably the best term to describe the sound of Dark Chambers. You do have a rather foreboding title theme that, despite coming out of repurposed 2600 sound processing, doesn't sound too bad, but that's about the only piece of music you could expect out of this game. The rest of the game is played in near complete silence with only the handful of sound effects left to fill the void. And the sound effects, well, they're not fantastic, but they're not horrid either. They're somewhere in the middle and somewhat tolerable to a certain degree. That's about as far as I'd go there. Overall, Dark Chambers on the Atari 7800 is a perfectly fine little overhead shooting game of sorts that may not possess aspects of Gauntlet that made that game an arcade favorite and eventual short-lived franchise, but holds its own with its simple yet challenging gameplay. It's easy to pick up and play, it's a fun little two-player romp, and there's quite a bit of fun to be had once you get to the more challenging bits of the game. I wouldn't necessarily call Dark Chambers a hidden gem of sorts, nor is there any reason to seek out an Atari 7800, not when there are similar games of this ilk elsewhere that are more enticing and quite frankly more exciting, but for what it is, it's more than serviceable and worthy of at least a quick sample via the Atari 50 compilation. All in all, this one's okay.